Hi, and welcome to week 3 of the Methods K-8 Science course for MSU Billings for fall of 2014. A quick guide to this week. There are 4 different readings. 3 are pretty short, 1 is longer. The 3 short ones are all articles from NSTA publications, which is the National Science Teachers Association, and they really were intended for in-service teachers to help get them up to speed on how the science framework that we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about this week applies to their instruction. And those are great articles. I really hope you enjoy reading them. The other reading is to read chapters 3 and 4 of the framework. It's a longer reading assignment. It covers 2 of the 3 dimensions of the framework. And hopefully in week 1 you read chapters 1 and 2. And on the sheet there's a link to download the framework for free, and all of those articles are free downloads. There are 3 videos to watch this week. The first is how to read NGSS, and that's a really short video put together by the authors, the publishers of the NGSS. And one of your assignments this week asks you to use their website, and so I want you to have some familiarity about how to kind of think about the structure of the document. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this video, but I'd like you to also watch their quick little video. And then there's a video from the teaching channel that is free. You'll need to make an account to watch the videos. We're going to use a lot of videos from them in this course though, so I would encourage you to make that account. It's free. And it's a video from a science classroom about using literacy in the NGSS. And then you have an activity to do this week that helps to prepare you to make your forum post, that helps you to look at how we can use NGSS as a resource for instruction, even though it hasn't been adopted in our state. So our 3 goals for the week are to develop an awareness of the climate around science in Montana, which is really important. That's the first part of this presentation. And we'll become a little bit familiar with the development and intention of a framework for K-12 science education, and then we'll talk about the 3-dimensional nature of science instruction aligned to the framework for K-12 science education. And then you'll have that activity that helps you to think about how NGSS functions as a resource to help us to plan our instruction and maybe take some of the work out of having great science instruction. So a quick history of standards and this little era of standards. We're going to start our history in 2006, and that's when we adopted our most recent science content standards. And those standards have a benchmark at grade 4, 8, and upon graduation for several topics. And we'll go through and I'll read the actual content of those standards. Those are the standards that currently our test is based off of, and the standard that districts are required to align their science instruction to. In 2009, when we implemented, after we had implemented our most recent test, many districts were really asking for more guidance about, well, if this is where we need to get by 4th grade, what do we need to do in 1st grade to be able to get there? And so a team of educators from across the state were brought together, and they wrote the essential learning expectations for science, and that document gives some grade level expectations. It's not an adopted document, and while many districts use it to help plan their curriculum, it's not something they have to use. It's not something you have to align to. Part of the complication and what we hear from a lot of pre-service teachers is that it's really confusing because you have these benchmark standards, and then maybe you've looked at these essential learning expectations, but your district probably has a document, and that document might be the same as neighboring schools, or it might be different from neighboring schools. And that's all kind of part and parcel of teaching in a local control state, where districts have been very intentional about maintaining the right to decide for themselves what they teach and how they teach it. And in science, because we still have this 2006 document that only has 4, 8, and upon graduation benchmarks, really you could, if you were to move between schools, you'd see very different things being taught at different grade levels, and sometimes even between classrooms within a school, you see really different things being taught because this document isn't required. In 2012, the framework for K-12 science education was published, and that document was written as a research project, actually, by the national academies. And their intent in writing that was to say, national standards projects have failed. It's hard to get all the states to agree on what standards should say. So instead of writing standards, let's write a book that says what instruction should look like. What should K-12 science education be? What is it that we know that's best practice? And so that book is the book that I've asked you to download, and we'll read significant portions of it for this course, and it's something that you'll find to be an invaluable reference. Also in 2012, a group of states came together and began to write the next generation science standards. We signed on as a lead state in writing that, and that meant that we attended some meetings and we had some involvement in the process. We got to give comment on confidential drafts. It also means that we made a commitment to consider them at the time of our next adoption. So when we update these 2006 standards, we will consider the next generation science standards as one of our options for adoption. In 2013, the next generation science standards were published, and since that time, what we've seen is a lot of changeover in terms of the focus of the national professional development, and the national trend in science is towards supporting instruction that's aligned to the next generation science standards. And so it becomes really important, both because they're based on what we know to be a sound document, the K-12, the framework for K-12 science education, but also because we start to see that transition more nationally to make sure we're aware of what those standards look like even before we make a decision about adoption. So on the subject of adoption, as of July 9th, 2014, and I believe that this list is still accurate, I don't think any new states have been added since July 9th. This is the list of states that have adopted the next generation science standards, and on this diagram you can see that they are orange. In the blue states, some step has been taken towards adoption. They have not yet officially adopted the standards, but they've at least made known their intention, or they've begun the review. There actually are some other states on this map who have adopted new science standards that look an awful lot like the next generation science standards, and they aren't colored in, and that has to do with political or other concerns. And the reality is that in America, politics and education will never be separate. And so in some states, it was not politically advantageous to adopt the next generation science standards, but the state was ready to do a standards adoption. And so instead of adopting them by that name, they adopted something very similar that allows them to then kind of capitalize on all of the very positive things happening in transitioning to better science instruction, but at the same time doesn't require them to buy in wholesale to all of the kind of noise that surrounds adoption of a national document. In Montana, since 2013, in the fall and winter of 2013, we did a gap analysis where about 225 Montana educators gathered together and participated in full-day meetings all across the state. And in those meetings, they really looked at how the standards that we adopted in 2006 compare to the next generation science standards. And right now, there's still a verification of those responses going on so that we can provide schools some more information about where the gaps are. The current focus in our state is in supporting a science literacy effort, in helping teachers to understand how science literacy and reading and writing and science matter, and then also how math and the Common Core math is important for science. And so within this course, we'll spend some time really focusing on what literacy looks like in a science classroom and how the Common Core is impacting science classrooms. And we talked some about that last week, and your responses in the forum were fantastic. You showed a lot of thought about what impact the Common Core might have on literacy, and we'll definitely talk more about literacy later in the semester. So a lot of people like to ask what's next for Montana with science standards, and definitely as a pre-service educator, I'm sure that that is very important to you, because when you get into the classroom, you want to know what you should be prepared for. And so the initial analysis of our alignment supports the use of NGSS by individual teachers, schools, or districts based on a decision by local school boards. So in general, the next generation science standards meet and exceed our 2006 standards. And the final document will note the exceptions. We do actually see some of our larger districts and smaller districts choosing to align their curricular materials to NGSS directly, kind of based on that information. Most of them have teachers who participated in alignment and are able to speak to how the NGSS actually covers the same material as our 2006 standards. That's probably useful information as a pre-service teacher because we don't know when we'll adopt again or what we'll adopt. And so for you to know going into a district, some of that information would be great, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that today. And we haven't set a timeline. The Office of Public Instruction doesn't adopt standards. The Board of Public Education doesn't have a timeline for when they're gonna do their adoption. And so we really don't have any information about when that will happen. However, depending on when you're going to graduate and enter the classroom, I would say that you could anticipate that you probably would have at least a little bit of time that you're still teaching under our 2006 standards, and that, you know, within the first few years of your classroom instruction as an in-service teacher, you would see a change in science standards. So let's get down to business, talk about the framework. So the framework that was published in 2012 says that science is composed of 3 dimensions. And it's not that this idea was new, because this framework is, you know, the authors of this framework have been authors of a ton of things for many, many years. So the ideas that they were kind of writing about in the framework aren't things that were just came out of thin air. The thing that was really revolutionary, though, about the framework was that when they published this framework, they came out and said that these 3 dimensions have equal importance, that as teachers, we should be putting equal weight on them. And if we look at the 3 dimensions, disciplinary core ideas, we can say is roughly equivalent to content. Science and engineering practices are the practices of doing science. It's, you know, those process skills of asking questions and doing experiments. And then this last one, the cross-cutting concepts, are those topics that come up over and over and over again every time we talk about science, things like energy and stability. And we'll talk more about those individually. But if we think about science instruction, if you think about the way you were taught in school, the primary focus has always been on these disciplinary core ideas. And in Montana, the last time we adopted standards, we tried to shift to put some more focus on science and engineering practices by really couching our standards in the language of inquiry and saying that investigations need to be happening and that students need to be building their own knowledge and understanding through those kinds of constructivist ideals. But according to the framework, we didn't take that far enough, because science and engineering practices should be just as important as any piece of content. So we'll talk more about what that means as we go, but when we talk about 3-dimensional science education, we talk about that idea of being 3-dimensional. What we're saying is that these 3 things are equally important and that they should always be together. They should never be isolated. I should never just be teaching content and giving a quiz. I should be teaching content and having students practice with it and make sure that I'm making students aware of where those cross-cutting concepts are within the content that I'm teaching. And this diagram to me really kind of shows that idea that student performance is kind of bounded by all 3 of these, and that if we lose one of the 3 of these, we kind of start to lose the definitions on our student performance. And so we at all times need to be making sure that we're using all 3 pieces of that 3-dimensional learning. So before I go into more detail about the individual dimensions, I want to talk a little bit about these principles of the framework. And you should have seen these principles of the framework in week 1 when you read chapters 1 and 2 of the framework. So when they wrote the framework, they had 6 things that they were focused on. One is that children are born investigators. When we think about K-5 education, and we hear over and over again that it's hard to make room for science, that I have to do my math and I have to do my ELA, and it's hard to make time, or I feel uncomfortable, I wasn't trained in science. And one of the things that's hardest about that is that children love to investigate, and that's what science is that opportunity to investigate. So one of the principles of the framework, this idea that children are born investigators, is to make sure that teachers are prepared to not be an expert, but to just give kids that opportunity to investigate, that opportunity to explore, which is their natural inclination. The next principle of the framework is the importance of focusing on core ideas and practices. We don't need to teach everything, We don't need to make sure that students leave school knowing all the things there are to know. And I remember when I was teaching high school physics, for a lot of kids, it was the last science class that they would take. Um, if they didn't go to college, maybe ever, but definitely um, a lot of them, it was the last science class before they went to college. And they were always kind of confused because in the past they had been asked to memorize everything. And I never asked them to memorize things. I would always let them have a formula sheet. I would always let them have a periodic table. I would always let them have all of those resources because in the real world, usually it's okay to go and look something up. And when we look something up often enough, then we remember it. Um, and so to me, I really identify with this idea of focusing on the core ideas, of not trying to teach all the things, letting people use the resources that are available, using the technology that's out there, and instead saying, this is the big idea that the students need to get, and this is the practice of science that they need to be able to do in order to get that. Um, the next one is that understanding develops over time, and that we need to be very intentional about how we scaffold instruction up, that we can start with some really simple understandings for elementary students, and then we can build on those simple understandings over time, that it's not enough to just touch on content once a year. We really need to build a deeper understanding that intentionally scaffolds upwards. The next one, that science and engineering require both knowledge and practice. We can't do science and we can't know science. We have to do both things together. Science is meaningless if we just go around experimenting and don't have any knowledge behind it. But it is equally meaningless to just spout knowledge without any practice or action. This next one is one of my favorites, connecting to students' interests and experiences. That it is more important to make sure that students understand why this matters, or that we see what matters to students and tie the science into that, than anything else, because that really brings them to that point of wanting to investigate and taps into that born investigation. And then the last one is equity. Every student can do science, every child can learn, and that if we can do this, if we can have this three-dimensional science, that we'll be able to have better equity and have more students who are really getting great science instruction that can speak to them, because this method will be better than lecture. Um, so we're going to dive into the three different parts of the framework, each of the three dimensions. We're going to start with practices. So there's 8 science and engineering practices that you'll read about, I believe, in chapter 3. The 8 science and engineering practices are asking questions and defining problems, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. In the readings, you got a lot more detail about each of those, and I'm hopeful as you think about that and as you prepare to make your forum post and answer especially that first question about how will including the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts benefit your students, to really think about how would it benefit your students, each of those things that you've read about, to have the focus be on making sure that before they leave your class at an age appropriate level, that they're able to do each of those 8 things. Doesn't matter if they knew all the planets. It matters if they have a data table, do they know what to do with it? It doesn't matter so much if they can name all the dinosaurs. It matters if, when they're looking at information about a dinosaur, they're able to construct an explanation for what it means. Are they able to look at 2 different pieces of information and use them as evidence to make a claim one way or another? Can they use these practices? How does that impact your students to prioritize these practices over the content itself? And I know in week 1 there were a few of you who said you were really excited about A, the idea you didn't have to be an expert, and B, the idea that science could be something different than what it was for you. And so how would a focus on the practices as equal to the content have made things different for you? Last week we talked a lot about the ELA Common Core, and we looked at that. I want to just show you this diagram. I can post a copy of it somewhere if you would like to have it. But it takes the published statements from math, the math practices, the student characteristics from ELA and the science and engineering practices from science. And it looks at overlaps in the specific language. So math talks about modeling, science uses modeling, math talks about using mathematics, science talks about using mathematics. There definitely are more overlaps than are shown in this chart. Places where the intent has an overlap, or places where we used a statement in science that definitely they do it in math. That just wasn't one of the 8 things they listed. So we could expand the overlaps here, but I feel like this is a really useful chart, especially when we think about elementary education and the number of people who are generalists and teaching all of the subjects, to really be aware of where those overlaps are, where the practice of doing math, science, and ELA converge, and you're able to kind of get more bang for your buck by having those integrated lessons. The next thing that I want to talk about is this, and I apologize, this slide is a little bit off, but if we can actually streamline the practices. Thinking about 8 things is overwhelming to me. And so if we take the practices and we split them up, that the last practice is obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. So if we take those and we say, well, when we obtain information, we're usually actually gathering evidence. When we evaluate information, we're usually constructing explanations. And when we communicate reasoning, or when we communicate information, we're usually communicating our reasoning. We actually can look, if we were to organize all of our instruction and say, we need to really go back and forth along this. I need to gather evidence about the trees in our yard, the trees in our playground. We need to construct some explanations about why those trees grow in our playgrounds, not others. And then we need to communicate our reasoning to explain, well, why is it that we have different trees in our park than we have at our house? Or why is it that when I go up into the mountains, we see a whole different type of tree than we see in town? Which is an age-appropriate elementary topic to think about the differences in trees, what they need to grow, and kind of what happens when we start to plant non-native trees in our space. As I think about the process of gathering evidence, these are the practices that I might be using or asking my students to use. When I think about constructing explanation, these are the practices that we might be using. And when I communicate reasoning, these are the practices that we might be using. So this diagram here has been really helpful to me as I think about planning for that instruction. Instead of thinking about all 8 things, I can say, which of the 3 things am I doing right now? Okay, now how am I going to do that? The next thing I want to talk about is the cross-cutting concepts. So when I introduced them before, I said they are the themes that are consistent across all of the domains of science. So these are the 7 cross-cutting concepts. The first one is patterns. And again, you read about these in chapter 4, so they shouldn't, you'll have all of the information that was written in the framework itself to kind of couch this, but I'm going to give a basic description for each of them. The first one is patterns. We know what patterns are. Some examples from science: the periodic table is a pattern. When I look at population dynamics, I look at the patterns of the number of different animals that are in a population. I look at patterns for weather. I think that's, we look at patterns when we look at the rock cycle. Any cycles are listed separately, but any cycle is really looking at a pattern of things that kind of come and go. The next one, cause and effect, mechanism and explanation. When I think about Newton's laws, for every action, there's a reaction. There's some definite cause and effect there. In chemistry, I see cause and effect. When I mix those chemicals, I see a reaction happening. In biology, we see a lot of cause and effect. We see it in genetics. We see it in when I water the plant, kind of what is if the cause is that I put more water in, what's the effect on the plant? The next one, scale, proportion, and quantity. We can see that everywhere. Whether or not I can find the right answer to the question that I'm looking for really depends on the scale that I'm looking at. The proportion of the proportions that we look at in chemistry. I'm sure anybody who took chemistry has kind of recurring nightmares about moles and balancing equations and figuring out what number went where to make sure that the proportions were right. And quantity is a huge issue. I'm gonna be, I mean, even in elementary, we look at when you're watering, can you measure? Does it matter how much there is? All of these questions become the same. Systems and system models. when I look at things like um, definitely in every different domain of science, we talk about systems, the system that a living system has within the body. We have systems, all of those. Energy and matter is actually, I'm going to come back to that one. That's one of my favorite examples about why the cross-cutting concepts are so important. So I'm going to use that one last. Structure and function, how much structure defines function. And I think this one is really interesting when we think about in biology, there's often a unit about structure and function and how the structure of an organ kind of determines what it can do. But then on the flip side, engineers use structure and function and design of I want this to be functional, but I want it to look nice. And so how do I balance those factors? And then stability and change, this idea of we're seeking stability and outside influences coming in and causing change and the systems and we think of terms like entropy and the example of the messy room. Unless I put a lot of energy in, it just keeps getting messier, it keeps changing. It's the natural order of things. um, and I just gave, going through these, a ton of examples from all the different domains of science. And the thing that's interesting is for each of these big topics, we could give an example from a domain of science. And I said I wanted to come back to energy and matter. Energy to me is such an important example of this. We can talk about energy in a simple machine and in the idea of physics, this, you know, force equals mass times acceleration, or work equals energy, or any of these formulas about energy. We can think about it from chemistry. Reactions take energy. Different reactions have reaction rates for energy. We can think about it for biology for sure. And to me, the simplest example is the idea of photosynthesis and plants making energy from the sun, or taking energy from the sun and turning it into ATP that cells can use. I find it really interesting that when I talk to students about energy, they'll tell me the one of those things that is relevant to the class they're taking right now. But all of those are the same energy. They have different names for different forms. But instead of teaching about energy as this thing that can take all of these forms, we teach one form in one class, and one form in another class, and one form in another class. And we talk a little bit about converting between types of energy. I have a windmill and I have a plug in the wall, and I'm converting between energy between them. But we're not, as a system of education, doing a good enough job drawing all the connections between those. And I think that's the idea of the cross-cutting concepts, and why they use the term cross-cutting, that these cross-cutting concepts allow us to draw all of the connections between all of the different things that we learned in science. Now, I know some of you just listened to this and you just got really overwhelmed and you started to have some flashbacks about time that you spent in a science class that you didn't like. And the good news is that most of the things I just mentioned, they're not elementary science concepts. They're things that we teach at a higher level of science. But the point that I wanted to make by mentioning all of those things, especially to those of you that have just come out of high school and are in the university system, you're maybe pretty close, much closer than I am, to remembering what it was like to learn all those things in school, is that as I talked about all of those things, did a teacher ever make those connections for you? And would that have made a difference if every time your teacher talked about cause and effect, they referenced the other examples of cause and effect? Would that have made a difference for you? Would it have helped you to make those connections between all of the different topics you were learning? So as you think about your forum post for this week, I want you to think about that. Would it make a difference? Will this change instruction for kids in a positive way? For the content, we have these things called the disciplinary core ideas. And I'm not going to assign the disciplinary core ideas to you to read. I am going to say that for those of you who put into your first week's post about how your introduction post about how you're interested in being reminded of some of the science that you learned, this section of the framework is the place to do that. It does a great job kind of surveying from kindergarten through grade 12 what types of things students should be learning, all of the different pieces of content that are really important. And I'm not going to ask you to read the whole thing, because I'd really like instead for you to think about the fact that as you are needing to teach things, that this can be your resource that you go to read about those topics. And so I'd like you to read it just in time when you're ready for it, not to read it all now, because that won't be meaningful. I do really want to highlight this quote, that an important role of science education is not to teach all the facts, but rather to prepare students with a sufficient core knowledge so that they can later acquire additional information on their own. And I think that's a really important part of the vision of the framework, that we don't need to make sure that students know everything. We just need to make sure that they're ready to learn things. So the three categories within disciplinary core ideas are life sciences, physical sciences, and earth and space sciences. Those are the same three categories we use in our current standards, and we can talk more later about how those things relate to each other when we think about the activity. For now, I just want to tell you what the categories of the disciplinary core ideas are, since we're not going to read that section. One other thing that I just want to cover, there are these 4 criteria that the authors used when they were deciding what a disciplinary core idea, or DCI, would be. One is that it has to have broad importance across multiple sciences or engineering disciplines, or be a key organizing principle of a single discipline. So those things that are only used in one discipline or are kind of secondary, those aren't disciplinary core ideas. They might be taught in advanced courses, but that's not something that's really important as a disciplinary core idea. And I think that has less impact for elementary education, because really what we see with this criteria is that they've removed some things that maybe used to be in standards and said this is really advanced material. Number 2, it needs to provide a key tool for understanding or investigating more complex ideas and solving problems. And so there's a lot of things that we really learn about it because it allows us to ask other questions later. It's not so much that it's the final answer. The next one is that it needs to relate to interests and life experiences of students, or be connected to societal or personal concerns that require scientific or technical knowledge. And you'll definitely see that one at the elementary level. This idea that there are things that kids are interested in, and we should be giving them the opportunity to investigate those things while they're interested. And this last one has a really strong impact on elementary, and that is being teachable and learnable over multiple grades at increasing levels of depth and sophistication. And so this idea that things that we teach at higher grades need to be accessible to younger students has made some impact, that there's some things that we might start covering in elementary that we didn't talk about in elementary before, in order to lay a foundation. That they've been very intentional about finding ways to make things accessible to younger students. So within the physical sciences, there's 4 categories: matter and its interactions, and you would probably identify most of the things in there as something you learned in chemistry or in the first semester of a physical science course. Motion and stability, forces and interactions, most of that stuff would be covered in physics or the second semester of a physical sciences course. Energy is, as I used it as an example earlier, it's a pretty interdisciplinary concept. And this piece of energy here does have maybe more information about energy transformations and energy to power things than we've had before. This last one, waves and their applications to technologies for information transfer, is an area where there's been a lot of shift in kind of what we would be teaching. Instead of just teaching about waves, the idea of teaching really about how do we use waves. And I personally would be really excited to go back and take that class, because what I learned, and actually even what I taught in the waves section of my curriculum, didn't actually teach me anything about information transfer, which is a huge topic in our world. In life sciences, the 4 categories are molecules to organisms, structures and processes, ecosystems, interaction, energy and dynamics, heredity, inheritance and variation of traits, and then biological evolution, unity and diversity. And those ones are actually very consistent, very much exactly the same as the big concepts that have been in our standards. And then in earth and space science, we have Earth's place in the universe and our systems, which are pretty standard. And then we have this one that's about Earth and human activity, which has a lot of information about natural disasters and how humans can protect themselves from natural disasters and changes on the Earth's surface, but then also how humans might be impacting the Earth's surface. And I want to be really clear that, if you're interested in what types of stuff is in that, because that's not something that was previously in our standards as much. You can go and read about that, and that they do a really nice job actually explaining kind of what their intent is in making sure that students have that information. So this slide right here has the 6 Montana science content standards, and I'm not going to read their whole text, but standard 1 is generally, can you conduct an experiment? Do you know how to do it safely? Do you know how to write a lab report? Do you know how to select the right tools? That kind of stuff. Standard 2 is physical science, and again, that's chemistry and physics, whether it's a two-semester physical science course or a full year of chemistry and a full year of physics. All of that falls into standard 2. Standard 3 is life science. Standard 4 is earth and space science. And then standard 5 talks about technology and the impact on communities. And standard 6 talks about historical developments in science and technology. And I want to point out that in our Montana Science Content Standards, we do find Indian Education for All standards in Standards 1, 5, and 6. We don't have any of those built into Standards 2, 3, or 4. Those content pieces of physical life and earth and space. We don't have any Indian Education for All in those. And so that's one of the things that we think about as we think about a transition to new standards, is how can we have more meaningful support for Indian Education for All in our standards. So in our activity, what I'd like you to do is take the Montana Science Content Standards or a district scope and sequence document if you're in a classroom, or if you have a target grade band or you're in a classroom and you just know of something that's covered in that classroom, just pick a topic. I don't think, because of the way our schools use the Montana Science Content Standards that we've adopted, it's not terribly important that you use the Montana Science Content Standards if that's not something that is being used in the district that you're working in. And then you're going to go to www.nextgenscience.org, search performance expectations, and follow these steps. And I'm going to actually walk through these steps with you really quickly so that you have an example of what that looks like. So once I click on that box, what pops up in my window is this, or I click on the link, I get this search performance expectations box. And the instructions tell me to click on, actually let me pull the instructions up in my other window. Even though I know how to go through these, I want to make sure I do it in the right window. So when I get to this search performance expectation box, it says to click on the red disciplinary core ideas. And when I do that, I'm going to select the topic that I've picked. And so let's say that what you decided to pick for your topic is weather and climate. It's a common topic that we teach in elementary school, and so maybe weather and climate is something that you know is taught at your target grade level. And so I'm going to click on weather and climate. I'm going to hit apply. And now my computer is thinking, and it'll come up for me with a list of performance expectations that are in the Next Generation Science Standards that are relevant. So let's say that I'm looking for, let's say that I actually was thinking I wanted to look for 4th grade. And what I'm going to find is that there is 1 performance expectation for kindergarten and 2 of them for 3rd grade, and there's not one for 4th grade. The way that NGSS deals with content spiraling to the grades is a little bit different than the way many of our schools do right now. So I'm going to pick these 3rd grade ones because they're the ones that are closest to my grade band that I'm looking for. And there are 2 things here for me to think about. One is that students would represent data in tables and graphical displays to describe typical weather conditions expected during a particular season. The other is to obtain and combine information to describe climates in different regions of the world. So let's say maybe I was thinking that I wanted this one for 4th grade. Maybe the district that I'm thinking about in social studies has a piece where we kind of compare Montana to other places. And so in science, if we're going to think about weather, having this idea of obtaining information and combining the climates in different regions would be useful for me. So once I've picked them, I'm going to read this part that's called the foundation boxes. Now remember, there's a video that I've asked you to watch that shows you how to navigate this structure of this document that you're looking at. And so I'm not going to go through all of the detail of that, but this is the foundation box. And I'm going to look through and I'm going to see, well, what they are saying, the authors of this are saying that when I do this, obtain and combine information to describe climates, as far as obtaining information, that the practice, this blue one is always the science and engineering practice, is to obtain and combine information from books and other reliable media to explain phenomena. Okay, so that's the practice statement. I can see how that's relevant to here. That's a good idea. I could have students go and read a bunch of books. Now that might seem like you think to yourself, well, I would have thought of that anyway. As we look across all the different examples, this one was picked pretty much at random. We see all these different statements down there about what practice students would do. So I think that's great. I could develop a lesson where I ask students to go and read about different climates in different regions of the world. The content here is that climate describes a range of an area's typical weather conditions and the extent to which those conditions vary over the years. So I'm going to want to make sure that the books they read talk about that. And then the cross-cutting concept that I really want to make sure students are getting is this idea of patterns, that patterns of change can be used to make predictions. So I can see patterns for different regions of the world, and I'm going to be able to make some predictions about where I would see things. Wouldn't it be great if you had students read about 3 different regions near the equator and select a 4th that they didn't read about and ask them to make some predictions about what we can say about a region near the equator. So I can build my lesson around that. So this, to me, I share this with you because I want you to see how this can be a really great lesson planning and unit planning tool, even though we didn't adopt these standards yet. If you have something you need to teach in your standards, whether they're district or state standards, that looks a lot like this, you can use this information to help you with planning. The other nice thing that they have is an alignment directly to the ELA and math standards, that in 3rd grade they're asked to ask and answer questions to demonstrate understanding of a text, referring explicitly to the text as the basis for the answers. So now if I'm being asked to align my instruction and produce statements about which standards I'm covering, I'm able to identify that when I do this unit, I'm covering these standards as well. So that's the activity that I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to produce anything. I want you to look at it, and then in your forum question for number 2, you're asked how can you use NGSS to support your instruction. So I want you to really think about how you could use this process of searching the performance expectations and finding something relevant to help support your instruction. I know this week's video was really long. Hopefully we'll have shorter videos the other weeks, but that was a lot of information, and this is some pretty foundational material for you to be able to consider as we get into the textbook and we think about some of the instructional processes of teaching science.